Hello everybody, this is Project Alpha. My name is Nikolai Feldman. You are watching live our stream with Alexey Arestovich. Good evening everybody. Let me adjust the lapel here. I do want to start immediately with Kursk district because everything probably most interesting is happening there. Do we see the organized withdrawal, retreat from that district according to your data, or do we need to continue keeping it? For some reason, as these two pieces, blue, highlighted in blue, underscore. According to my data, Nikolai, the stories about withdrawal and organized withdrawal are fairy tales, are from the land of folklore. My information is that each brigade is trying to evacuate itself, and I sincerely hope that this information is wrong. As for the factual situation, how much are we holding? We are holding part of Kursk district, they're holding part of Sumy district nearby, so the situation is far from being completed, and I suspect it is partially as a result of an agreement. And there are several indicators to this effect, starting from statements by Russian correspondents in their media to some vernacular spilled by Trump. And what am I talking about the organized event when I talk about that? First is that the township is not being bombed. They're not using heavy artillery on the buildings. They're using only drones and small arms. And it's very little information coming out. The fact that we do not have enough, that it's very little that comes as a pipette, as a dripper out of this situation, it should actually invoke certain concerns about what is happening there. That is, even if we do not pay attention to our public and unofficial statements of our military in Ukraine. This is not a regular question. This is one of the key questions of the truce, of the peace accord scenario that seems to be happening. And when all the talking heads are saying that everything is under control, like everyone else, every head continues to repeat the same narrative, but they cannot disclose any more data. So I do have a question to our political leadership in Ukraine. You did acknowledge that our troops are fighting on the Russian territory in this district. Why are you being so shy about it now? Alexey, do you think they're trying to wrap it as some achievements of Ukrainian forces and that they are actually welcoming the peace accord? Well, Nikolai, the statements should follow the framework that we're going with. Our problem is that we do not have a defined framework, because one day we're fighting till the last Ukrainian, next day we're withdrawing. One day we want peace, the next day we do not. Putin one day shows us some grace, the second day he apparently wants to capture the whole Ukraine till Lvov, till the western border with the EU. So inability to create this framework, which some people even call strategic ambiguity, I see it as a kindergarten. And our strategic communications are so poor because our leadership, our strategic leadership, doesn't know what it wants. If they did, every stage would be crystal clear how to communicate and what it is about. Because all strategic communications are about very simple thing in its core. You need to outline the goal that you're going for and explain how the ongoing scenario is achieving this goal. And that's it, that's simple. Instead of this, we have some very fairy tale, folklore and legend-like weavings from our politicians as to why and how. Life is much simpler than that. Life is usually pretty straightforward. And when you hear 4 or 5 or 7 different angles and some very sophisticated 10-step process, just know, be aware that you're being lied to. Every time you see a plan that's more complex than a 2-step, chances are it's full of BS. All right, Alexey, last week, Forbes analyst David X mentioned that Russian occupants got some advantage in Kursk district. I think it's a little incorrect to call them Russian occupants in regards to Kursk district, but speaking of the overall situation on the front, he is saying that on the other parts of the front, Russian operations have either slowed down or went into reversal because Russian army is depleted. And this is what is being used by Ukrainian Armed Forces to change situation in some parts. So, Alexey, what do you think about this article? Nikolai, I admire the art of vernacular. All these adjectives and descriptors, how Ukrainian or Russian army is depleted and tired, and one day they're depleted, the other they're not. I can only imagine our general gathering our troops somewhere and asking, are we guys storming these positions? And they're telling, no, we are not, we're depleted. And when he checks what's happening, you've been okay yesterday, they are saying, no, yesterday was a different day, right? This is all militaristic. This is not real. This is all literary effort, what he is describing. The reality is that Russian group was running on fumes. Their offensive, the last of it, was actually running on what was left. They did not properly conduct another drafting season and mobilization. So not surprising, because Putin knows that everything goes towards peace. He already was talking to Trump at that time about ceasefire, so there is no reason to stress Russian society by additional mobilization outside of the usual planned draft. And you know that he knows that if he will go with the mobilization, this will create more rifts inside Russia, will make war even more unpopular. So they were trying to get by without mobilization, and they were riding this wave as long as it could. Meantime, we replaced one commander for another, for Drapatov. Not to compliment him, but he understands a few things a bit better than others. And he starts to counterattack on different parts of the front. And I can imagine, given the overall degree of control that we have over our troops, I would say that we are not too technical in our actions now on the front. Our troops are just basically running for the village that they were told to recapture, to liberate. So just these efforts were enough to problematize some of Russian push along the front, not everywhere, but I think near Pokrovsk, that's what happened. But I think the main reason is not our brave counterattacks, but the deployment of the forces of the 8th Army to Konstantinovka direction. And here's why. Because why would one pull a long tentacle towards Pokrovsk that is open on all sides for Ukrainian counterattacks if the peace agreement is soon to happen? So it'll be a very uncomfortable protrusion. Let's go a little further here. Okay, you see that protrusion over here at the bottom? It's not exactly effective. It's only effective when they are continuously attacking and expanding their presence. But you see the dotted line? This is the border with Dnipropetrovsk region. And Putin is not demanding this region to be included into Russian Federation in any agreement, in any form. So they are supposedly going to the border with Ukraine the way they describe it in their constitution. And if they start crossing this dotted line, then probably Trump and Chinese might start asking questions, what exactly are you doing there? Meantime, taking Konstantinovka is more important in this light. It is important to be completed before the truce happens. That's why they moved a lot of forces from Pokrovsk direction over to Konstantinovka. And they've been moving towards Konstantinovka. They still continue doing it. Chasiv Yar is still a very hot area. So let's be honest here, our brave counterattacks are only working near Pokrovsk. Overall, the enemy is still slowly advancing on the whole front, or most of the front. Similar situation is with Kupiansk defense. You can see that evil red spot is generally spreading around. Situation there is not developing fast. It's very heavy local fighting, but they are indeed moving. So let's describe it in this fashion. Russian army does not have enough means and resources for successful crushing operations, but they have enough resources for systematic fighting. And in those places where we actually use some of our reserves, and where we used the fact that Russians actually withdrew some of their troops. That's where we got some successes as slowing down their advancement on those directions. And that's it. There's nothing really to write home about. And present it as depletion of Russian army, that's a little premature. I would not do that. Well, Alexey Aks is saying here that because of Kursk district, the area where Russians are sending the best resources, including elite group Rubicon of UAV command, and he is not excluding the fact that the balance on the east of Ukraine may change again if Russians succeed in the Kursk district. Then they could move that special detachment, Rubicon, again to a new part of the front. I don't know why he's paying so much attention to it. Nikolai, that's just pure bellitristics journalism. Let's describe how these brave, however many people in that detachment are changing the flow of war, and they're lucky or successful wherever they're present, and everybody else are just praying to get them as a reinforcement at some point. But there is a seed of truth in these statements, because if they do bring extra troops, including more UAVs, to some part of the front, they will likely get some advantage on this part of the front. So, do you think, Alexei, they will take Konstantinovka soon? How long will it take them in your estimation? Well, it's longer than a couple of weeks, at least a month likely. It'll probably be more than that. So why Putin should, you think he shouldn't be in a hurry? Well, he doesn't need to be in a hurry. He technically can create a situation where they can change the line. And for him, he needs to be able to change the front line to the degree that they can use it if the war is to ignite again. That will be more favorable for them. They're not hoping to take Kramatorsk or Izum. They're creating the outline of the front line that will give them more advantageous positions. I think that's what they're working now for the future, if it is to continue at some point. So for negotiations, Alexei, do you think we would still benefit by keeping a piece of Kursk districts under Ukrainian control? Or should we withdraw and demonstrate it as the gesture of goodwill towards the truce and negotiations? Well, not exactly a goodwill in this case, or not forfeiting anything to Russians, but at least to indicate that we are ready to negotiate. And this is probably the case where we need to keep a good face when the game sucks, because we know that we have to withdraw, but we can actually spin it in a way that, look, we are kind enough, we are meeting the demand for peace accords, and we are withdrawing our troops, we are de-escalating. What about Russians? That's how we could present it to Trump and his administration. But in order to do that, our leadership needs to have some matter between their ears. Well, speaking about future negotiations, Alexei, that are supposedly going to happen this week between Trump and Putin, a lot of people are commenting on this. Let's probably look first at Goncharенko, the People's Deputy Congressman from Ukraine, who is saying that we have a chance to get Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Plant back. And he is saying that I can affirm that Trump administration is discussing Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant. And actually, Trump did mention that in one of his speeches. Oh, Nikolai, you're saying that we are in a difficult fork of whom to believe, Trump or Goncharенko, right? I might need half an hour to think it over. It's a difficult moral dilemma. All right, still, Alexei, if we do take the overall framework of what can be discussed tomorrow between Trump and Putin, what do you expect? What can we expect, Nikolai? I'm not basing my life in expectations. I just know where the vector is going. And I think it goes like this. Let's discuss the main pain points. Kursk district, Zaporizhzhya nuclear power stations, numbers of troops joining NATO, perspective, guarantees, using the fund. Presidents will be talking about the whole spectrum of events, or perhaps they might outline also the several important milestones and discuss just them. These phone calls, by the way, Peskov noticed that too, that these conversations are usually take weeks to prepare, outlining that the list likely will be rather long. And all the public opinion is just running after the little cards. Somebody showed you the blue card with Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Plant, and everybody is running and looking at this card right now. I want to remind our listeners that whenever you're being shown something, you probably are being to shift your attention from something important. For example, from a status of Crimea that bleeped on the American media that Trump might acknowledge Crimea to be Russian, not to force Ukraine to do that, but acknowledge on his own behalf that it is Russian now. So what do you want? Zaporizhzhya nuclear plant or Crimea? Or both? Speaking of nuclear station, it is important, of course. But I can give you 101%. If Putin is giving nuclear power station back to Ukraine, he will likely get for this so-called goodwill gesture. Nuclear power plant multiply by 10. Or equivalent of that. And you can try to deduce what can be so costly. People also notice that Trump is not pressing on Ukraine for demilitarization, according to Reuters, for example, that they are talking about all other demands, but not demilitarization. Well, it's the same logic, Nikolai. We understand why Russians want to demilitarize Ukraine. They want to create conditions by shrinking our military down to 100,000 and maybe 50 jets to have one day when Trump is either asleep or sick or maybe playing golf, so they could push the button and solve the problem in 3 days that they could not solve in 3 years. And capture it so quickly that even for America, for Trump, it would be difficult to kick Russians out if they succeed in this operation. I think everybody understands that. And now answer me. Trump is drawing a certain framework. Do you think he will be adding to this construct certain risks that pose a significant threat to crumble this construct in under 3 days? I don't think so, Alexey. That would be weird, right? Of course. So likely they'll try to protect this construct that they're developing from being demolished in under 3 days. So this is a significant element here. I don't think they will do it. I don't think they will go for it. I think they will go for anything but demilitarization of Ukraine, and Putin will have to swallow this pill wholesomely. But he definitely will request something in exchange for this. So for Trump to acknowledge Crimea being Russian, what does it give? What does it create? Well, at the very minimum, on the technical side, it could be leaving additional sanctions behind. No, I mean not to Putin, Alexei, but for Trump. What does it give him? Oh, he can trade most bonuses for Ukraine from this statement, like Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant, retaining the number of armed forces, keeping shipping industry working in the Black Sea. These are key elements. And here's another question that I want to pose. What are the perspectives of Crimea going back to Ukraine? Nikolai. Oh, they're very remote, right? You're looking at me through a zero or through a telescope? Yeah, something like that. So if we are looking at the situation from the terms of realpolitik, why don't we exchange that virtual asset for something else? We have another very strong virtual asset, and I am amazed by stupidity of Ukrainian leadership that they still cannot change neutral status, which we have now, and refusal from joining NATO for some super bonuses from Russia, because Russians are actually ready, or officially saying they're ready to trade for that. Yet we have Sibiga coming out today in Ukraine and saying that, and he's objecting to Rutte, to the head of NATO. He is saying that, well, we do want to say that, personally, we are against it. Like in that anecdote, I'm like that little bird that will fly to the sun alone. It is written in our constitution that this is a collective will of Ukrainian people to join NATO, and you, some puny 32 little European countries, you just have to take us into NATO because this is the will of Ukrainian people. This is utter stupidity, instead of doing exact opposite, which would be, in this case, we understand nobody will welcome us to NATO, Rutte mentioned that, but Russia really worries about us joining NATO. Then, of course, exchange a bunch of real bonuses for unrealistic joining NATO. Putin needs to sell his victory to his people. For that, you can exchange not only Zaporizhzhya nuclear plant, but a lot of other things. And, you know, in my childhood, when I was studying French at school, they used a funny phrase for us to build up our French pronunciation. And the phrase was said in a French accent, but the core, the meaning of the phrase was a sheep was eating grass. So here we have exactly that. Our sheep are eating grass stubbornly, and they're refusing to see the real situation. All right, Alexey, let's remember last week Telegraph, the British publication, told their readers that Trump's plan and tactics in regards to Ukraine actually matches the plan of Kellogg that was publicized about a year ago. And they explained the core of this plan and why one should not be surprised with Trump's actions. And that plan actually does have a dual ultimatum, that ultimatum that Trump was talking about, that we talked about in these streams here, and it was implied that if dual ultimatum is being presented to Ukraine and Ukraine refuses to follow that plan, then immediately all military aid will be seized, which actually happened, right? Right until the moment when Ukrainian delegation did change their mind rather rapidly in Jeddah. And situation changed then. But one should understand that probably the same type ultimatum, according to this structure, will be presented to Putin as well, right? So if tomorrow Putin indicates that he is not in agreement with Trump's ultimatum, what real moves, in your view, does Trump have outside of rearming Ukraine? All right, Nikolai, let me switch to military language. So I do want to be blunt in this regard, and I'll try to stay in the military mode answering this question. So translating that to military. All right, imagine you are a criminal authority sitting in jail. And when a police or a group of police come into the room, you cannot jump immediately to break your authority, not to break your authority with your other gang members who are sitting in the same room. But if you'll be very slow, you'll get a boot under your ass from this policeman. So the high art of knowing the situation, of reading it, is in getting off the bench slow enough to not lose the authority in the eyes of your jailmates, which are watching you very carefully, whether you'll jump up or not. But if you will also be very slow, you will get that boot under your butt. And what will be remained from your authority after that? So the high art of remaining in authority is lifting up slow enough so that you appease the both sides. And Putin understands that. He accepts generally Trump's vector, but he's trading it and doing it slow. He understands he cannot go into the secondary measures that may come from his stubbornness, because Trump will likely kick his butt, but he doesn't have much cards to respond to that with. What can he do? Start nuclear war? Trump even doesn't need to start the fight with Putin in this regard. He can just slap 2 more sanctions on him and the country. And that's the art. Putin needs to get up slow enough, yet fast enough, to avoid getting his butt whooped. Unfortunately, Zelensky is not so bright. He affords himself to throw a tantrum in the Oval Office, then run to Europe to get support, and then his supporters will hug him and tell him, and the king will shake his hand, but they will still direct him back to the Oval Office. And suddenly, in 2 days, Trump gets an apologetic message from Zelensky, saying that, sorry, our blood ran a little too hot. And I think it's a very simple explanation that I used, right, with the jail and the boot. All right, so if tomorrow these negotiations between Trump and Putin somehow conclude with Trump's statement that I will be slapping more sanctions on Russia and they failed to come to an agreement with us, what these sanctions do you think will be about? I think in this case they can continue hitting the energy sector because this is the main source of income for Russian budget. Trade with India, with China, with Europe. And yeah, they can tighten the bolts a bit more because a lot of sanctions are already there. recently Trump already put Russian banks under a certain threat in regards to economic sanctions, and it basically preparing and showing that if the negotiations will fail, the future will be very problematic for Russian financial industry. And we can also see that they did discuss restoration of Nord Stream and creating some Russian, Ukrainian, American energy consortium that will be likely making money on Europe selling hydrocarbons to them. So why argue? Trump and Putin, they're mostly about money. They have certain influence on them by different groups, but themselves they are rather pragmatic and they're quite realists. So I am not expecting the negotiations to go south, to go sour. I think there will be some achievements on it. I think Putin will try to abstain from getting his situation deeper in a more problematic area. When they specifically can continue talking and figure out and perhaps find a better future for themselves. So they likely, in my estimation, they'll talk about a couple of most contentious elements, and we'll see about statements that they'll make. Even if they will come to some disagreements, they will probably make a couple statements, or maybe the initial statement coming out of negotiations will be rather weak, but then they will likely continue negotiations behind the screens and they will find mutual language. I think so. They will find a common agreement. Alexey, do you think a Russian gray fleet is in danger of sanctions too? Well, Americans, Nikolai, control about 70% of all the trade routes in the world. I think they have full capacity to slow it down or make it harder. Speaking of ideological pressure on Putin, Alexey, Washington Post published another article that the document that Trump prepared for Kremlin defines a very stern position towards Russia in regards to the war, and Russia has to work to soften this position of Washington. Russia will likely have to walk a difficult path to appease Trump administration and also continue promoting their efforts to dismantle the Ukrainian sovereignty. What do you think they imply in this article about this dismantling of Ukrainian sovereignty? So what do they imply by dismantling of Ukrainian sovereignty? In this publication, they refute possible steps forward to let Ukraine join NATO or have parties that support that. According to this article, that Ukraine cannot be recovered, you need to completely dismantle Ukrainian sovereignty. The only thing that they did mention that this document that Washington Post obtained does not necessarily dictate Putin's regime how to act, and nobody knows where it came from. So what do you think about this dismantling of Kievan regime and how can it be used in negotiations with Trump? Alexey? I think, Nikolai, first of all, Washington Post is just working through the documents given to them by Russia or some Russian sympathizers that is aimed at making Trump's efforts more problematic and difficult. Because whatever Trump is doing, whatever Russia is doing, the end goal is for Russia to annex Ukraine. So this is the document just attacking Trump's administration from that angle. Is there a plan in Russia? And does anybody follow this plan? There is only one person who defines Russian plans, and it's Putin. We do not understand how exactly Russian forces work between each other, because there are a lot of stories about Kremlin towers, how they interact with each other. Yeah, there are some liberals, there are some enforcement agencies, but they're all concerned and afraid of Putin. That influence exists only to the degree that he affirms that. Putin's model is rather clear. He needs a continuous war, continuous conflict to maintain his rule over Russia. In Russia, there is a big group of youth that is significantly against external and internal politics in Russia. There's a huge part of society, and it continues to grow, that is against regime. In a few years, it will become several millions of electors, of people voting for things in Russia. That's why Putin's power is hanging on a thread, and he knows that. And having an ongoing conflict is a tool that he can use to maintain his power, because any external policy is a continuation of internal policy. And given he cannot turn Russia into North Korea, but he can turn it into North Korea light. And does it have any relation to taking Ukraine all the way to Lvov? Probably not, because if you do capture the whole Ukraine, you may actually get yourself in a wrong situation where you're out of this conflict and you have bigger internal conflict brewing on your hands. So this is the destiny of dictators. If you add too much effort, you may accidentally topple yourself and strain yourself to the point of toppling. If you show Lvov to some fellow from Perm in Siberia, he doesn't even know where it is, and why would he need it, right? But if you don't do enough, then you don't have enough conflict outside to maintain your power. So in his preference, this war would have continued for 5 years, for 10 years, however long it can go. And now, here's the thing, it only is possible if it continues the way it is, because the moment we replace Zelensky with somebody, and we accidentally become more effective by 15% than now, Ukraine may actually start winning this war on the front, and perhaps even get some territories back. So this is a shaky equation for Putin too. Can he go for a peace deal? Of course he can, because Trump can offer Putin something much more valuable than a long-term war. Success that he can sell internally to his population, that he can use to strengthen Russian position in the world. Arctic exploration, China, India, all these relations and trade. So it all depends upon the size of the offer from Trump, and I think Trump is making a big enough offer, and not necessarily at the cost of Ukraine, but by giving Russia a position in the New World Order, which, if Trump was more tuned to confronting Putin and his regime, Russia probably shouldn't be having all these levers and power in this New World Order. But for Russia, this is a huge bonus. This is way more important than who owns Pokrovsk. So we can see what likely he will be selling for it. And Ukraine is not even on the first place in this dilemma. It's maybe on place number 5 or so. And in regards to Ukraine, if Trump would not offer Russia and China to participate in natural resources and some trade together, they would not have any reason to stop. But as for the big treaty, that's a good reason for them to stop, because that outlines their new role in the world. So, Alexey, regarding your previous comment about not getting your butt too quickly from the chair in jail when police officers coming in, some people think, and they publish materials to that effect, that Russia cannot stop the war too soon, that it might be rather deadly for their internal processes. What do you think of it? I think this is giving the wants for the actuals. Because if after each start of war or finish of war there would be some scary processes happening in Russia, here's my question. When? When would that start? After the lost war, perhaps they would be facing these consequences. But how can one count this war as a loss? A lot of people, they're saying, will come back, 1 million will come back. Well, there'll be at least 300,000 still guarding the border with Ukraine. And even if the rest of the soldiers come back, what is that for the territory of Russia? And 30 million people living there? So yes, there'll be maybe an uptick in criminal activity, but I don't think it'll be a big blip on the radar. Remember, Putin put 5 army commanders behind bars under investigation. You think he won't put 10,000 of criminals or those who came back from the war and are misbehaving now? Of course he would. So these stories that Russia cannot stop the war, no, I don't see them true. Russia can follow the whistle from Kremlin and stop it. So you think, Alexey, that he has this power, that will? Well, Nikolai, who can object to him? I'm trying to honestly imagine who can object to Putin. Putin is telling Gerasimov to go into ceasefire mode, and Gerasimov would reject and say that no, we like fighting, we continue. Then, the KGB bullet will penetrate his skull pretty quickly. My favorite anecdote on this topic, there is a victory parade after the Second World War, and Marshal Zhukov of Soviet Union is receiving that parade on the Kremlin podium on Mausoleum. And he is greeting his troops. Good day, dear tankers. Hooray, Marshal. Good day, dear pilots. Hooray, dear Marshal. Good day, KGB officers. Hello, Mr. Zhukov. Right? So I remember this anecdote. You did mention that before, but this is a good illustration. So another question. United States is leaving the group of investigating war crimes of Russian Federation. Do you think this is part of normalizing this war, or just normalizing relations with Russian Federation in the framework of these negotiations? Yeah, this is, I think, only Nikolai in regards to these negotiations. I don't think Trump is thinking altogether about a bigger picture in this case. Of course, they are protecting themselves and Israel from the International Criminal Court, and now they're protecting Russia to be able to continue with negotiations. But I do have a question to our listeners. Do you want to prosecute somebody, or do you want peace and stop fighting? If you want revenge, those who are seeking revenge, they're not building cities. They're not building beautiful future. They're busy with revenge. So when you really want to avenge somebody, when you want to go there, remember that you only have the past in this case. You never have future. The future is technically impossible with this mindset. All right, Alexey. So in this matter, I think the question is not so much about being upset, but about legal classification. Because some person from Russian Federation who committed a war crime after the war is over might find himself in the resorts of, let's say, Egypt, and he might meet some, let's say, Ukrainian activists or non-Ukrainian. Do you think something will happen? Well, this matter will be resolved first between them, and then it'll be by Egypt police and their investigative organs. It will not be America or Ukraine or Russia acting on this event. And we could have played a bigger role here. We could have come out from Ukraine and say, and actually precede these events and be the initiative generator and say, let's forgive everybody except for the most atrocious crimes in this war. But we're stuck in this revenge. We're still upset at the other people's scenarios. And we either giddily run like little kids, or we are just stubbornly sitting as a ram, or more like a gate that are looking at the ram. And this is what's upsetting me. Not so much that Russian criminal war crimes will evade the justice, but that we are not being active here. We're not offering our own scenarios, some scenarios that would create a new reality. Look, for Ukraine, I think it's more atrocious, not that we do not punish some idiot who was shooting people in Bucha, but what's atrocious is that we do not have a scenario for ourselves. We're waiting for Trump and Putin to decide. All right. So about normalizing relations with Russia, I wanted to bring words of Mark Rutte here, General Secretary of NATO, who gave interview to Bloomberg. And the journalist is asking him, before you became a General Secretary of NATO, you were leader of European country. Are you ready after these events in the war to continue conducting relations with Russia? Because we keep hearing that maybe trade will continue happening with Russia. Well, Mark Rutte is answering to this, saying that, first of all, I am not there negotiating with them. We do have sanctions against Russia, and let's not be naive that they are not working. But I understand that in the long term, Russia will come back. I meant that Russia will never disappear. They will still be out there. And I had a lot of dealings with Putin as a minister before the war, before this stage. And I think that it would be good if, when this war stops, for Europe and for United States to eventually, gradually restore normal relations with Russians. But we're not there yet, not quite. We need to continue exerting more pressure on them to make sure that they are ready to conduct serious negotiations with American administration and, of course, with Ukrainians. So, in my view, this is a certain framework. And I may be wrong here, but it might be expressing the consensus of most NATO countries, or majority of them, because Rutte is presenting progressive European public. Or what do you think? Nikolai, let's put a different question here. What pressure can NATO exert on Russia? and exert it in such a fashion so that Russia would sit down to negotiate with the United States. Just before the beginning of this stream, when I saw the news that one of the European bureaucrats complained that Europe is not present at the negotiation table, I think it was worded that Europe is failing to acquire a seat at this table. But I do want to pose a question here. What is NATO without the United States of America? It's nothing. And yeah, here it is. I found that news. Kallas, the ex-president of Estonia, Prime Minister of Estonia, is saying that European Union is looking for ways but is failing to find a spot at the negotiation table between Russia and the United States. And Rutte here comes out and says that Trump will be following what we tell him and we will continue exerting pressure on Russia. This is how I read this phrase. You think it sounds like this? Well, that's how it sounds for me. He is saying in this interview that he needs to explain to Trump that he needs to continue exerting pressure on Russia. So if I was Trump, I would answer him, so why are you telling me this? Who are you and how long do you think you can exist without our support? When you create your own army, perhaps, but this is not the reality yet. And that's it. It's as if I would be pressing Nikolai Feldman to conduct an interview with me later today via myself. So all these scary statements of European journalists and European officials, this is just trash. This is just garbage. Rutte is still talking, right? Trump made Zelensky sit down and talk. He made Putin talk to him, but Rutte is still blabbing around. So, okay, that's fine. Alexey, there was another interesting dialogue that Trump had with Rutte, after which Rutte had some issues with European countries, for example, Greenland. And Trump mentioned in his meeting with Rutte, saying that I did not think about that before, but since I'm with a person who might be very useful in this regard, we need Greenland not for our own purposes, but for international security. You know, we have a lot of alien vessels going around this route. And this is a very important matter for us to talk about. I think we should. To which Rutte responded that this is a problem of Arctic and I need to keep it outside. I don't want to make life more difficult for NATO. But when you are talking about the North, we do know that Russians and Chinese are using these routes. So you're correct there. We know that Russia and China are rearming, and yet we do not have enough icebreakers in Europe. So we need to make sure that European countries do work together with the United States to ensure security of this region and that it will remain secure and safe. And we need to be there, added Rutte. So it doesn't appear like they have a misunderstanding. Plus, there is a full acknowledgement from Rutte in regards to the role of the United States in this dialogue about Arctic territories. And I don't think that those people who have any illusions about non-unity between Rutte and Trump or EU, NATO and states, I think they are pretty well aligned, or am I wrong? I think, Nikolai, it looked like this. Respectable Mark Rutte is flying to the United States. He comes to the office and he's being told that, dude, if you want to be ahead of NATO, let me know. Make a decision right now. There is an opinion that NATO needs to support us in main questions, Arctic, Greenland, Moscow, etc. And he was leaving Euro-Atlantic, but he's coming back to Europe, Atlantic European. Why? And he's getting a lot of questions back in Europe. Why? We're trying to struggle with Trump, to fight somewhat with him, and you're coming back so pro-Trumpian here. And he can only say that, guys, after the meeting with the minister on a yacht, I did not have any other options. Another important question, Alexey, and I want you to maybe help us understand Trump's logic altogether, because there are a lot of statements made that let's not press Russians out of the territories that they captured because this has a shadow of a Third World War on the horizon if we do it. On the other hand, situation is rather being compressed on the perimeter of this war by United States without the risk of Third World War or with it. Nikolai, let's then define what is a world war. World war is two coalitions of countries that exceeds the 3 oceans or 3 continents territory. And who can start this war of that caliber, except for China, Russia, India, and the United States? Nobody. Europe doesn't have an army. And world war between Europe and the United States over Greenland, that's anything but the world war. And it will probably be over in about 45 minutes if it starts, if Americans are serious about it. So Trump may pressure anybody in any fashion he likes without being afraid of the World War III if he has his ducks in a row with India, Russia, and China. And he does have generally things in a good order with those 3 countries. Even a war with Iran, this is not a third world war. At best case, it's a regional exchange. And for now, it's just an exchange of blows. That's why whenever somebody says that we don't need a third world war, that basically Trump is implying that I don't want a situation when Russian or Chinese missiles will hit our beloved United States. But do you think he really considers that France or Canada or Britain defending their protectorate will be hitting the territory of the United States proper? I don't think it's a serious proposition. That's why he's not afraid to clash with European politicians on that vector that he creates a pressure on. So this is just a low-risk direction for him in regards of Third World War, right? Right. What Third World War, Nikolai? A war between the United States and Denmark? I think it's unreal. Well, there is a situation of the 5th article, right? A better question here one can ask, Alexey, whether NATO still exists or not. No, it doesn't, Nikolai. And that's why Rutte may make any kind of statement he wants to. Look, NATO problematized its existence from 3 angles. First of all, Russia said, we don't give a damn about NATO. Go back to the borders of 91. And NATO, everything they did, it just delivered 50 tons of fuel to Ukrainian army. That's all that NATO did. As organization? Yes, as organization. Second, Trump and Vance said, we don't give a damn about NATO. We may withdraw our troops and bases from Europe, and we cannot guarantee Article number 5. And the third, Europeans are acknowledging that we cannot really rely on NATO because Americans are not exactly with us at the moment. We need to create our own army. So that's the third knife in the back of NATO. Or do somebody expect that the United States will split and part of the United States will be defending NATO country and another part will not be defending? So Danes will see the fights of American jets, one fighting for one side, the other for another, right? I don't understand how that may happen. It's very simple, Nikolai. Whoever is stronger is right. But not only that, also you have to have a meaning. In Trump's administration, Vance and Musk are responsible for the brains and for the strategy, and Trump is responsible for power. And you may not like it, but this is the reality. All right, so reaction in Europe overall, let's dedicate the last segment here to it. Politico made a publication about Macron telling his colleagues in EU that it's enough to buy American, start buying European. Those who are buying Patriot systems, we need to offer buy our SAMP-T, French-Italian manufacturing. Instead of F-16s or F-35s, we need to offer Rafales jets. So President Macron wants to start an enchantment program to convince European countries to purchase French and European military equipment instead of spending money overseas in the United States. So you did mention before that Macron wants to become the leader of European army and lead that development in Europe. But my question is simple. How advanced is the equipment that Macron is advertising? How much can it replace American? Because I remember just on the other stream you mentioned that SAMP-T, and Macron is saying that there is a new generation that can actually be as good as Patriot. But you did mention before that the previous SAMP-T could not replace Patriot effectivity. So if it does, though, if it's so effective, why don't we have SAMP-T in Ukraine? Or the ones that we do are usually out of missiles. So the best advertising would likely be showing off these European achievements in Ukraine. Right? Well, first of all, Nikolai, we are using European arms here in war, but of the older generations. And second, Macron is a drama queen. He makes beautiful and emotional speeches which never result in anything. Then second task for Macron is not to save European Union, but to prevail over Le Pen. with his parties that support him, while Le Pen is actually relying on the French generalty, because France is one of the few countries in the world that produce the full cycle from small arms to nukes, jets, and submarines. And of course, they're trying to sell their French-Italian manufactured Rafales with some input from Spain, but there are very few of them, and it's difficult to increase the production rate for these jets. This is the matter of years, while Americans just give systems and sell systems that they already have. And there are no real capacities to support these beautiful words, these politics. I think they got infected with Ukrainian disease. A lot of conversations with nothing behind them. And look how Israelis are working. They usually act first, and then they talk. And even in regards to actions, very often they do not acknowledge that it's them. Unknown jets destroyed Iranian column near Damascus. This is the actions of somebody who is powerful. Less words, more actions. And when there are more declarations, this is for the birds. End of the first hour.